Rain. On racing circuits, it's considered one of the great equalisers, but for road-going performance cars, rain is, well, a bit of a wet towel. But today I plan to use precipitation to my advantage. Here we have two genuine all-weather performance cars in the Audi RS7 Sportback and the Mercedes-AMG E63S. And we're at a very wet, very greasy Wakefield Park circuit in Goulburn to see which is best.
Ordinarily, these conditions would be considered a no-go zone for four-door supercars. And let's be honest, that's exactly what these two are. The E63 follows a family of E-Class vehicles dating back to the original Hammer of the 1980s, while the RS7 sits at the pointy end of Audi's horsepower rankings. Both have been updated in recent months and are all-wheel drive and output about 600 horsepower in the old money. Although they compete for similar buyers, there are some noticeable differences. The E63 is a traditional sedan, while the RS7 Sportback has a more design-oriented profile underlined by its coupe-like lift-back rear. The Audi is also significantly cheaper at $224,000 compared with a touch over $250,000 for the AMG. For the record, we also requested the updated BMW M5 competition for this test, but there were none on fleet.
This pair took on more common ground in 2017 when the E63 moved to an all-wheel drive layout. Now, although the move was initially met with some scepticism, the general consensus was that all-pawl grip was a great way of harnessing this car's twin-turbo V8 engine. For 2021, AMG engineers have revisited the internals of the E63, but it wasn't the engine they were worried about.
Instead, AMG engineers have quietly replaced the subframe bearings and bushings, recalibrated its active engine mounts, replaced the tie rod bearings and retuned the software responsible for the active dampers. The AMG's three-chamber air springs are said to share the same spring rates or stiffness as before. The AMG marginally betters the Audi in terms of outputs, with an additional 9 kilowatts and 50 newton meters from its 4-litre displacement. In the all-important 0 to 100 dash, the Merc wins it by a nose as well, 3.4 seconds versus 3.6 seconds claimed. The speed here is raw and scintillating, not that you'd really expect it from the E63's decidedly executive body.
Smart and understated? That sounds like the key character trait of any performance Audi for the past 15 years. However, the 2021 Audi RS7 Sportback is no shrinking violet. It has a decidedly more extroverted appearance with bulbous guards, huge 22-inch wheels, and more styling changes inside and out. It's not all just cosmetics though. The engine has been augmented by a new 48-volt mild hybrid system, and it has 50 newton meters more torque than before, just shy of the AMG.
Adaptive air suspension has also been added, while an RS Sports exhaust and 22-inch Audi Sport alloy wheels are standard now as well. Stopping power comes from large 10-piston calipers up front, gripping huge 420mm front discs and 370mm rear discs, bigger than the AMG on both counts. However, the latter was optioned with carbon ceramic brakes on test. Conditions on this day are tricky, so we've enlisted the help of Tim Brook, a champion in Toyota's competitive 86 Racing Series and a current front-runner in the V8-powered Australian Trans Am category. We'll get our star racer's thoughts in a moment, but first, it's time to try and tame the RS7.
Now these two cars, it is definitely the RS7 Sportback that feels the more confidence-inspiring on a circuit. Granted, they're both all-wheel drive. Granted, they both have 4-litre twin-turbo V8s outputting around 450 kilowatts, but it's the way that the RS7 goes about its business on the circuit. It feels the more connected to the road, and in wet conditions it feels more tied down as well.
The RS7's user-friendly traits are augmented by its all-wheel drive system, which feels less susceptible to switching ends over standing water. Although the same Pirelli P0 tyres have been shod to both vehicles, a slightly different tread block lends the RS7 another small advantage.
In this test, it really does feel like the more confidence-inspiring choice. There's a little bit more roll on turn-in with the RS7, but that rear steer system does mean that it feels really quite well tied down at high speeds. It turns in nice and consistently, and it feels very natural and organic, which is a really important element. It really feels safe, sure-footed on a racetrack, wet or dry. Of these two vehicles, this is probably the car that I felt more comfortable in faster.
In the hands of our resident racer, the RS7 feels more manageable and stable in the conditions as well, with shorter braking distances and more advanced driver electronic aids, at least in the wet. That brings us to the AMG.
Now these two cars, the E63 feels like the quintessential German hot rod. That is the hallmark of the AMG nameplate, and it really does stand strongly in this car. It is a brute of a thing. It's tail happy, it's muscular, it's got a great soundtrack, but it can be a little bit intimidating, at least initially on a green, wet track. The E63 is a car that really asks you to just grab it by the scruff of the neck and take control. And when you do that, it is quite a willing accomplice, even on a really wet circuit. Of these two cars, it doesn't feel as well tied down. The electronics kind of nip at the wheels rather than intervene in a really linear fashion like the RS7. And I'll be honest, initially it felt really intimidating, especially when it was flogging down with rain. But you start to get used to it a bit more and you really do feel the rear drive attributes of the E63. I'd argue it's probably not as quick as the RS7 on a wet circuit, but you're going to be having a lot more fun behind the wheel of the AMG.
Although it is hard to exploit pure horsepower in these conditions, the AMG wins it for outright punch and muscle. The tunability of the E63 is another clear strength in this comparison, in the form of 3-stage air suspension, more drivetrain and chassis adjustability. It speaks to the fact the E63 is the more track-focused of these two. Even with a slightly muted exhaust note for 2021, it is certainly the more extroverted offering. And once you come to grips with its power and attitude, it is highly entertaining as well. Tim noted the AMG's electronics felt more intrusive, and that its narrower front tyre may have impacted turn-in response and balance. When he stuck to the racing line, Tim said you had to work harder in the AMG, but when you did, it would be a lot more fun. Away from the circuit, the RS7 gets the nod in terms of road comfort, with a more compliant ride, less road noise and more refinement. The RS7 also wins points for its low-speed manoeuvrability, thanks to its rear-wheel steer system. The AMG's drivetrain is subject to some binding during tight, low-speed cornering, but the gearbox is noticeably smoother than the Audi's during curbside departures. The interiors here are both first class, the Audi with lots of aluminium trimmings, faux carbon fibre highlights and lashings of Alcantara suede. Dual screens in the centre fascia effectively divide climate control and other vehicle settings from the infotainment, while the digital instrument cluster is clear and concise in its readouts. The Audi's liftback style rear is a clear winner for boot space. However, its design does impose more compromise in terms of rear seat space and tow room. Over in the Mercs corner, the interior has a greater focus on dynamics, with deeper bolstered front chairs and go-fast cues. There's a new steering wheel with capacitive touch controls, plus reworked touchscreens with camera-based augmented reality sat-nav combining digital graphics with a live video feed of the road ahead. On the maintenance front, the AMG trumps the Audi with a more generous warranty, 5 years unlimited kilometres versus 3 years unlimited kilometres. However, the Audi is almost half the price to service over a 5-year plan, at $3,910 compared with a staggering $7,000 for the AMG.
Now you might rightly question why we'd choose to take two $250,000 luxury cars to a circuit, but I think today the RS7 and the E63 have both shown that the electronics and driver aids in these modern 600 horsepower cars are so good that you simply can't exploit them on a public road. Both have been really impressive and are genuine all-weather cars, but for me it's the Audi RS7 that takes it by a nose.